Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each episode of this podcast talks about computer science education from the perspectives of practitioners and researchers by interviewing a guest or multiple guests, or doing a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to CS education. In this particular episode, I am unpacking a paper titled Re-examining Inequalities in Computer Science Participation from a Bourdieusian Sociological Perspective. This paper was written by Maria Kallia and Cutts. Alright, so here is the abstract for this particular paper. Quote, "Concerns about participation in computer science at all levels of education continue to rise, despite the substantial efforts of research, policy, and worldwide education initiatives. In this paper, which is guided by a systemic literature review, we investigate the issue of inequalities in participation by bringing a theoretical lens from the sociology of education, and particularly Bourdieu's theory of social reproduction. By paying particular attention to Bourdieu's theorizing of capital, habitus, and field, we first establish an alignment between Bourdieu's theory and what is known about inequalities in computer science, CS, participation. We demonstrate how the factors affecting participation constitute capital forms that individuals possess to leverage within the computer science field, while students' views and dispositions towards computer science and scientists are rooted in their habitus, which influences their successful assimilation in computer science fields. Subsequently, by projecting the issues of inequalities in CS participation in Bourdieu's sociological theorisations, we explain that because most interventions do not consider the issue holistically and not in formal education settings, the reported benefits do not continue in the long term, which reproduces the problem. Most interventions have indeed contributed significantly to the issue, but they have either focused on developing some aspects of computer science capital or on designing activities that, although inclusive in terms of their content and context, attempt to reconstruct students' habitus to fit in the already pathologized computer science fields. Therefore, we argue that to contribute significantly to the equity and participation issue in computer science, research and interventions should focus on reconstructing the computer science field and the rules of participation, as well as on building holistically students' computer science capital and habitus within computer science fields." End quote. If I were to summarize this particular paper into a single sentence, I would say that this paper uses Bourdieu's discussions of capital, habitus, and field to analyze 147 publications on CS interventions. Now, in the show notes, you can find a direct link to this particular paper, as well as a link to the author's Google Scholar profiles. You can find that at jaredoleary.com, where there's hundreds, if not thousands, of free CS-related resources, including a link to bootupPD.org, which is the nonprofit that I create curriculum for. And that curriculum is also 100% free. Now, just a little disclaimer before I get started, and you probably noticed this from the abstract, Bourdieu is a little bit more complicated than you typically see in educational scholarship. So from a sociological perspective, Bourdieu particularly talks about power and capital and the way that structures impact society. So here's a little explanation from the introduction, and this is on page 379. Quote, "Our theoretical lens stem from the field of sociology of education, and as such, we see education, achievement, and outcome being affected by the interplay between school structural patterns and social class stratifications, among other factors. Schools or universities are seen as micro-societies in which issues of authority, democratization, role structure and position, power and dominance, the interplay between social classes, their culture, language and gesture, hidden structural rules, social stratification, and elitism are some of the perspectives to understand a given problem." End quote. In other words, if you're going to use Bourdieu's theory as a lens to look at something, then you're likely going to explore those things that were just kind of listed right there. Now, another famous person that we talked about briefly in an interview with Roger Manti is Foucault. So Foucault is another philosopher, sociologist who has discussed similar topics. So Bourdieu and Foucault kind of have some parallel scholarship that are interesting to investigate if you are interested in looking at the interplay between social structures and power on people and groups, which is particularly important if you're interested in equity work. All right, so here are the research questions for this particular study. This is from page 379 and 380. Quote, "How can inequalities in computer science participation be understood by applying sociological perspectives and particularly Bourdieu's theory of social reproduction? What new directions and opportunities does the sociological alignment offer for tackling issues and inequalities in computer science participation?" End quote. All right, so here's a quote from page 380 that kind of discusses Bourdieu's theory a little bit more. Quote, "His sociological framework is based on the sociology of power, and it is particularly useful for investigating how resources are allocated in society and how a person's internal dispositions are influenced by society's external structures." End quote. A little bit further down on that page. Quote, Bourdieu argued that the education system contributes to the reproduction of the structure of power, relationships, and symbolic relationships between classes. As such, for Bourdieu, schools are regarded as mechanisms for reinforcing the social and cultural inequalities, end quote. And a little bit further in, quote, for Bourdieu, the social and cultural reproduction within schools is generated purely by the tendency to acknowledge students who are ready to participate in such a school system, whereas due to the school's structural refusal of inability to discontinue this tendency and to develop a pedagogy that considers nothing for granted, it leaves behind the unprepared working class. Bourdieu's view of school structure highlighted the power that is transferred within schools by the privileged groups in society. By doing so, these groups legitimize their dominant culture at the expense of the less privileged groups that lack the resources and opportunities to obtain the legitimized cultural and social capital, end quote. Okay, so I mentioned this in a podcast that I did well over a year ago that was on maker culture, and so it was a critique of it. And so in that particular critique, I don't remember if they actually cited Bourdieu, but they certainly could have if they didn't. But they mentioned that the maker movement isn't anything new, and in fact, if anything, it is a whitewashing of blue-collar jobs that is largely done in communities of color and communities of low socioeconomic status. But by rebranding it as something that high socioeconomic status people and middle-class people can do. And in particular, some of the studies that mention that much of the imagery and media around the maker culture involves white males. The kind of interplay between power dynamics going on right there can be viewed from a Bourdieusian perspective. Now, another more concrete example directly related to CS is if we think of storytelling versus problem solving. So some cultures have a lot of high value on storytelling, while other cultures tend to have value on problem solving. And it's not to say that you can't have both, but if we look at what's kind of gone on in computer science curriculum over the past decade or so, there's been a huge focus on problem solving through like problem-based learning and whatnot, to the point that storytelling has been kind of put on the back burner. Like some platforms and languages, you can't tell stories with them. You're literally just solving puzzles or problems. Now, if we look at where the funding is coming from for some of the organizations that are promoting that, it's often coming from well-intentioned donors, such as large tech companies who are trying to get future engineers or software developers or whatever. Now, from a Bourdieusian perspective, this can be looked at as a dominant culture is allocating resources to promote one way of being, one ontology, that being problem solving or way of knowing, or an epistemology. And this can be a form of like axiological colonization or a colonization of the values that I've mentioned in other podcasts that is putting storytelling on the back burner. And that is not to say that it's good or bad. I'm just pointing out that this is a way that you can look at that particular scenario through a Bourdieusian perspective. Just to give you some context for how you might use Bourdieu's writings. And for clarification, I read some of Bourdieu's work, not all of Bourdieu's work, so I don't consider myself to be a scholar of it. Okay, so the next section of this paper, starting on 380, it discusses three different aspects of Bourdieu's sociology of education, which is great because I haven't heard it discuss much in CS education. So if you want a deeper dive in this, check this out. And it points towards some publications that you can dive even deeper in by actually reading these source materials, or at least the translations of them. Because Bourdieu was French, so if you can speak French, great. If you're like me and you cannot, then you'll probably read the translations. All right, so the first main thing that they discuss in here is Bourdieu's notion of capital. So from Bourdieu's perspective, quote, capital takes time to accumulate, it can be reproduced or expanded, and as a persisting force, it has the power to create possibilities or impossibilities, end quote. Now, there are three types of capital that they mention in here. So one of them is economic capital. So this refers to financial resources. So it could be owning land, it could be having money, could be equity in your house, etc. The next one, cultural capital. This can be converted into economic capital, and it is learned through social interaction or socialization. So this could be like social manners, like when to stand in line and when not to stand in line, or like a queue, or social manners about how to greet somebody, or how to listen in a conversation. That's different depending on which culture you're in. So for example, should you engage in eye contact or avoid eye contact? In some cultures, one of those is considered to be disrespectful, while in other cultures, that same thing that was considered to be disrespectful is valued or preferred. Now the authors break it down into three more distinct versions of cultural capital. So one is embodied capital, the other is objectified capital, and then the last one is institutionalized capital. Here's a quote from page 380 and 381 that kind of summarizes each of those three. Quote, embodied capital, which includes long-lasting dispositions of the mind and body, and it is usually transferred from a person to person, from a parent to child, example, knowledge, manners of speaking. It is transferred into an integral component of the person, into a habitus, another construct, and it functions as symbolic capital. This indicates that it is not being acknowledged as a capital, but rather as legitimate competence. Objectified capital, which refers to cultural goods like books, instruments, machines, and its necessities, and it necessitates embodied capital to be fully valued. Institutionalized capital, which is a form of objectification, e.g., formal qualifications. End quote. And then the last one is social capital, which they kind of describe as like the social relationships that are beneficial or generate some kind of a good outcome or beneficial outcome for a person. So these forms of capital are to be used as a resource that can give you some kind of an advantage or elevate your status within society. So for example, if you are a millionaire, that might be a form of economic capital. If you have a PhD, that might be a form of cultural capital. And if you are somebody who has a good relationship with people in industry or decision makers within a field, then that might be a form of social capital. So these are important to look at in education to just kind of understand some of the power at play within the field. Now the next section in here is habitus, which I've also heard as habitus, but the one that I've heard most frequently is habitus. If it's wrong, I apologize. Here's a quote from page 381. It is considered as the way of culture is embodied in the individual, as a system of embodied dispositions that are the groundings of an individual's practice and behavior. End quote. A little bit further down, quote, habitus is reflected in individuals' predisposed actions that align with the social structures they hold. Thus, habitus is a way of portraying the social structures as being embodied in individuals and as a way they understand and act in the world. This view, however, does not marginalize the individual's own agency, and therefore, it does not imply that social structures are deterministic of behavior, end quote. Okay, so a way that you might be able to think of habitus is it's like the habits or the dispositions or the ways that you engage in society that are valued. And you embody those valued forms of engagement by enacting them and simply doing them in social context. All right, so the last area that they unpack is field. So this is from page 381. Quote, Bourdieu describes the concept of field as a social space of interactions, a space of struggle and competition. In this field, individuals are classified by the capital they possess, and that is the reason why researchers often use the concept of market to describe fields, as it better emphasizes the capital exchanges. Individuals have diverse purchasing capital, as well as different forms of capital, which they can use to their advantage. The nature of the field, therefore, is hierarchical, and the individual's classification within the field is determined by what is valued and valid in the field, and thus individuals with a high volume of valued capital will hold the highest rankings. End quote. Here's one more quote from page 381. Quote, in education settings, the field involves the structures, principles, and values of the classrooms, e.g., the expected ways of behaving, norms of interactions, and discourses. In order to succeed, students are supposed to play according to the rules stemming from the field. End quote. All right, so tying it back to earlier. So in order to succeed in the CS class that I mentioned, that if it's a curriculum that is using problem-based, what's valued is solving a problem, not your ability to tell a story through code. So even if you are the best storyteller and you can code a really awesome project in Scratch, if you can't solve a problem in a particular field that values problem solving, you would have lower status than somebody who could solve the problem. So if you are from a particular culture that values problem solving, great, you'll do really well in this field. But if you are in a culture that does not value problem solving and values other forms of being or other ways of being, you will not do as well as somebody who does value that. Now, from an educator standpoint, we have the different forms of capital to consider. So like the economic capital might be how much you make as an educator. So if you work in a private school that pays more, then that might have a higher value than a public school that pays less. From a cultural capital standpoint, if you have an EDD or a PhD, then you will have higher status within the field. And from a social capital, if you know people from universities or organizations or departments of education, that can also give you some power to be asked to join advisory committees, etc. And if your habitus aligns with a particular field, then it makes it so that you can be promoted within that field or at least have higher status than other educators who do not have those forms of capital or habitus. Okay, so the next section talks about the method for this particular paper. So basically they looked at 147 papers and they tried to specifically find CS interventions, and then look at it from a Bourdieusian perspective to better understand the interventions that they engaged in what forms of capital and habitus and field were basically implied or mentioned indirectly in the papers itself. So the next main section, starting on 383, kind of unpacks each of these. So on page 383, that section talks about the different factors influencing participation. So they broke it down into a cultural theme, a social theme, and a psychological theme. So from a cultural perspective, that might be having some kind of an impact on a culture. So for example, improving the views and dispositions of computer scientists. So for example, CS is largely dominated by white males. So if you are a black female, then there might be an intervention that was developed to try and help you see a place for yourself within a field that is largely white males. Now, from the social theme, that was kind of like providing social support, so like role models or guidance, like guidance counselors and stuff, to assist with the particular intervention. And then the psychological theme was like stuff like looking at self-efficacy and sense of belonging within the field. Now, 41% of the 147 papers were within school settings, which means 59% were in informal settings like hackathons or competitions or summer camps, etc. All right, so the first research question was, quote, how can inequalities in computer science participation be understood by applying sociological perspectives and particularly Bourdieu's theory of social reproduction, end quote, from page 384. So within that, the first subsection is on knowledge and skills. And so this is an intervention that improves CS knowledge and skills in some way. So for example, we designed an intervention that was going to improve computational thinking. So they'll measure like pre and post or something like that. The next subsection of this focused on views and dispositions toward computer science or scientists. So like I mentioned earlier, like if you're in a marginalized group that typically is not seen within computer science as a field or within media. So these interventions were like trying to improve your sense of seeing yourself as a computer scientist, or at least somebody like you or within your community. All right, so the next section of this particular question is social capital related to computer science. And so here's a quote from page 385 that kind of summarizes this section. Quote, to develop the aforementioned skills, knowledge, and particularly positive dispositions and views toward computer science, a supportive environment and access to computer science opportunities are particularly important, end quote. So they summarize some different studies that kind of fall within that particular description. So if you're interested in that, I recommend checking it out. The next section is on the psychological capital in computer science. And so in this section, they mention that there's some research that suggests that a field that is familiar to someone can be accompanied by positive feelings such as ease and comfort. Whereas if a field is unfamiliar to a person, then it can be accompanied by shame, fear, anxiety, or indignation. That paraphrase is from page 386. So if we have students who have cultural capital and habitus and exist within a field in their home life that values CS, then they will likely approach it and find psychological rewards for participating in it. But if we have cultures that do not, then it's going to have potentially a negative psychological impact on students. So it might instead create a disdain for CS or something like that. So if you're interested in hearing more about the studies for that, check out that summary on page 386. Also on that same page is the next section on interventions. And so there were some different types of interventions. So improving knowledge and skills, or the dispositions, or broadening participation and focusing on like self-efficacy and sense of belonging, or even building some social spaces where mentors and teachers could kind of get together to provide some support for students, or even their peers can provide support for each other. If you want to see studies that talk about that, check out the citations on 386 and 387. And then on 387, there's a section on computer science capital, habitus, and its impact on participation. So I'm going to read the final paragraph of this particular section. Quote, overall, the central theme that is highlighted here is that although there is a vast amount of papers that aimed to address inequalities in participation with indeed significant contributions, inequalities continue reproducing until today. Until this point, and by focusing on Bourdieu's notion of capital and habitus, we have identified two potential reasons. First, most of the interventions focus on some of the components of computer science capital instead of considering it as the combination of four aspects: cultural capital as reflected on students' knowledge and skills and views and dispositions, and social and psychological capital. Secondly, most of the interventions implemented in extracurricular activities, which means that the reported positive changes on students' capital, and particularly on students' habitus, reflect a particular point in time rather than long-term benefits. When students return to formal educational settings, the misfits between the habitus and the structure of the field might cause an inner conflict that students may be unable to handle. Therefore, the structure of the field is equally important when we consider the issue of participation, but it seems not to have been the focus of studies in computer science education, and thus the next section focuses explicitly on highlighting its importance and the new research directions stemming from this, end quote. So the next section of the paper talks about the second research question, which was, quote, what new directions and opportunities does Bourdieusian lens offer for tackling issues and inequalities in computer science participation, end quote. Page 387. So the first section of this is discussing capital and habitus are not enough. All right, so I'm going to read for you two quotes from page 388 that kind of summarize this. Quote, we believe that the structure of school and university computer science fields is likely to legitimize specific forms of capital, not necessarily depicted in the literature, and thus favors the students who already possess this capital while unconsciously rejects other capital forms and habituses that do not align with its structure, end quote. And a little bit further down, quote, while research has focused on investigating how the content can be more interesting for all students and meaningful by creating engaging context, and on educating the teachers on inequalities issues while enhancing their pedagogical content knowledge and creating culturally relevant instruction, less attention has been given to the underlying rules of participation. What exactly constitutes valid, legitimate participation in computer science? How the structural positions of its agents are formed and claimed, and who determines the rules of the game and gives the power of the agents to sustain these rules, end quote. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. So one way that you can look at this is they mention a lot of studies look at like pedagogy, approaches that help improve understanding of computational thinking or something along those lines. And you focus on what occurs within the classroom space. So like what the teacher is doing, different types of approaches there, or how the students are engaging. So are you going to code with one language or a different language or a different platform, etc. While these studies are useful, the authors might argue from a Bourdieusian perspective, you might zoom out a bit and look at some of the structural inequalities that might exist within that. So for example, is your class going to be offered as a mandatory class? Or is it offered as an elective? Or is it offered as something that only a select set of students will participate in? So for example, the gifted and talented programs, which is a term that I don't like. Some other schools will call it the honors kids. Other things to consider is, will students have access to devices, both within the school and outside of school? And if so, how frequently? What about internet? So if kids have access to devices at home, but they don't have internet, how does that create forms of inequalities compared to the students who do have access to devices at home? Zooming out even further, which schools within a district have the opportunity to do this? Which districts have the opportunity to do this? What standards are being reinforced or introduced within schools that are either mandated or voluntarily directed by Departments of Education? Or by like the CSTA's national standards? And who are the people who make those decisions? Is it donors from corporate influence? So if you have a district that is supported by a local corporation, do they get to have a say on what students learn and how? These are the kind of questions and things to consider from a Bourdieusian perspective that often is not discussed from a specific intervention. So if you're a researcher, great. Take a look at Bourdieu, zoom out a bit, take a look at some of these structural inequalities that might be impacting students. Yeah, you may have created the best summer program ever, but when they go back to their classroom, there are still going to be some inequalities that need to be addressed that aren't addressed by the intervention that you designed. From a teacher perspective, try and consider not just what you are doing in the classroom, but how students are able to continue their engagement and their learning outside of the classroom. What factors are preventing students from continuing their learning outside of school? What's something that you can do about it? What kind of committee can you form to do something about this? Etc. All right, so the next section that answers the second research question basically argues that we need to have a more rigorous discussion around inequalities. So if we think of, from like a Paulo Freire perspective, pedagogy of the oppressed, the dominant and the subdominant class, or the dominant and the dominated, this particular section kind of unpacks that concept from a Bourdieusian perspective. So this is from page 388. So here's a quote. Quote, the dominant class consists of students with higher levels of capital. It is the class that possesses the right amount of capital to leverage within the field and therefore have the advantage over students of the subordinate class because the former joins the field with the necessary resources to succeed and position themselves higher in the hierarchy. In computer science fields, this group consists of students with a good background of knowledge and/or skills related to computer science, and thus the course content appears familiar to them. These students share a common language and discourse related to computer science, a specific style of communication and interaction with their peers of the same position and with their teachers. A code of interaction relevant to computer science and accessible to those with high computer science capital and positive views and dispositions towards the discipline, Habitus, that aligns with their future goals. The subordinate class consists of students that do not possess the capital to negotiate their positions within the field. This group is further divided into those who are interested in weakening the symbolic order and those who go through a form of symbolic violence, discussed below, lodged in the Habitus, end quote. So on page 389, here's a quote that talks about symbolic violence a little bit more. Quote, symbolic violence indicates a gradual acceptance and internalization of ideas and structures that tend to subordinate certain groups of people, and because of its invisibility constitutes an effective tool of silent domination and silencing the dominated, end quote. So going back to the problem-based versus story-based, a form of symbolic violence might be, hey, we value problem-based. This is the platform we're using. It only does problem-based learning. We don't have the opportunity to engage in storytelling. You need to learn how to engage in computer science in our way rather than try and approach it from something that you would prefer or are more familiar with. That's an example of symbolic violence. It's saying our way is the right way to do this, and you need to assimilate to us rather than engage in computer science from like a multi-perspectivalist approach where kids can explore CS through many different paths or venues. For example, in my class, kids had opportunities to work on several different languages and platforms that they got to choose, and within those platforms, they could work on projects that were interesting to them, rather than mandating everybody engage in the same project the same way. That would be described as a form of symbolic violence, or at least could be if you use a Bourdieusian perspective. Here's a final quote from page 389 in this particular section. Quote, all in all, for the dominated group to be heard and be part of the game, it is not enough to just permit them to speak, nor to increase their capital alone, nor to introduce content familiar to their culture while sustaining a pathologized field. But rather, systemic and cultural changes should be implemented to accord agency in this group, structuring the field narrowly and creating and reproducing limited definitions of what it means to be engaged and participate in computer science. What it means to be a computer science student or scientist reproduces disadvancements, particularly for students whose habitus seem not to align with the field, end quote. All right, so the paper ends with a discussion on some of the gaps in research and future directions and some suggestions. So basically, if I were to summarize those couple pages into a short paragraph, I'd say that the authors argue that yes, we should take a look at the interventions that are like on pedagogy and like how students learn and things like that. But we also, if we want to have systemic and long-lasting change, we need to look at the structures that are influencing participation in order to better understand how we can have a larger impact. So instead of using a microscope to investigate an intervention, we could instead look from a kaleidoscope or multi-perspectivalist approach that looks at systemic changes over time rather than one-off implementations or interventions. All right, so that's kind of a summary of the paper itself, which I do highly recommend reading. It is denser than other CS education research out there, but I highly recommend it. And it includes a lot of citations to other publications that dive deeper into this particular topic. So each one of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I'd like to share some of my lingering questions or thoughts. This one's going to be a little bit different. So I have a question for you. And so the question is, what do you want to learn more about this topic or other topics in CS education? So you can respond to this by hitting the contact me button at jaredoleary.com, or you can comment in the website by going to the bottom of the show notes and then respond there, or you can send me a message on Twitter or something, which I only check about once a week. So I apologize if I don't respond right away. But I genuinely want to know what you are more interested in, what topics I should dive deeper on. Some of the Unpacking Scholarship episodes and interviews that I've done have been more undergraduate level discussions introducing a particular topic, while others have dove deeper, so more of a graduate student version of discussing like equity or gender or power dynamics or whatever. I'm trying to provide some kind of a balance between breadth and depth, but I'm curious what topics you would like to hear more about in particular for me to dive deeper on. Now, the next couple of weeks are going to be podcasts related to National Suicide Prevention Month and awareness. Next week's episode is a repeat of an episode that I did the previous year. It is the most important episode I've ever recorded, as it can literally save some lives if you dive deeper into learning more about depression and suicide ideation in education. And then the following episode is a supercut of the guests over this past year talking about how they prevent burnout. And then following those two particular episodes, we will resume doing some interviews and some unpacking scholarship episodes. So please stay tuned for those particular episodes. And until then, I hope you all are having a wonderful week and are staying safe.